This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Israel Institute, enhancing the study and knowledge of modern Israel. I'm Dahlia Shenlin. Unfortunately, Gilad's not with us today. Every week, we talk about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. And of course, you can always support us by going to tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review and becoming a Patreon. A little goes a long way. Our guest today is Dr. Nitzan Lebovic. He is an associate professor of history at Lehigh University. He focuses on Jewish German culture, Holocaust, Israel, and Hebrew literature. He's the author of 5 books in Hebrew and in English. And we'll be talking about his most recent one, Zionism and Melancholy, The Short Life of Israel Zarchi, published by Indiana University Press. It's a sort of psycho-literary drama and a political history all in one. And I want to mention that he's one of the founders of Academia for Equality. Nitzan Lebovic, welcome to the show.
Hi, great being here.
Tell us about Israel Zarchi. Who is he and why is he so sad?
Israel Zarchi was born in Jędrzejów in Poland in 1909. Why was he that sad? I don't know. I mean, that's a big question. He emigrated to Palestine in 1925, became a pioneer, idealist character, idealist person. And I think he met with a very tough reality here.
So in a way, his sadness or his melancholy, which we'll talk about, is maybe part of his personality, but also part of his experience.
Yeah, definitely. And what interested me in this research is actually the gap opening between the ideals, right, and the reality found on the ground.
And that gap is what you found somehow controversial, or you see that gap as a criticism that he brings to his literature.
Yeah, I think that meeting the reality, of course, meeting such difficult conditions on the ground, I think create an emotional affect, right? And the emotional affect translates into something that we identify with sadness or sometimes resignation, and that could translate, of course, to a certain political understanding of that gap or that discrepancy, between the different levels or layers of, discourse, the idealist discourse, the ideological understanding of what the Zionist expectation is all about, and again, what one actually sees on the ground.
Yeah. I mean, he was a very prolific author, and, I think a main point of your book is that he was forgotten, and you write he was unjustly forgotten, even though he was so prolific. And in some ways, the book is a literary review of his work, but in other ways, it's almost a sort of j'accuse of his having been left out of the literary canon of Israel. Why do you think he was left out?
There are different ways to answer that. One way to answer that, I think, is through, again, the melancholic affect. He wrote with a lot of sadness about failures, a series of failures of the Zionist settlement in Palestine during that period. I think that mode of storytelling didn't really fit well, didn't really sit well with the Zionist ideology, formal ideology of the time. The critics, when they respond to his literature, reflect that. So one of his best colleagues, his advisor, and one of the best-known critics at the time, Yosef Klausner, talked in his obituary, actually, for Zarchi's death, about his literature as a state of imperfectum. So he thought there was something about this melancholic state of mind that did not answer Zionist expectation, right? That's one way to answer that, but there are, of course, different ways to answer this.
Well, I mean, were the other writers of the time writing about a more idealized version of the Zionist dream? I mean, think of his tell us about his contemporaries.
There are, of course, many, better and lesser known. Agnon, Bialik, Brenner are usually the best known among them.
And these are not writers who, paint a perfect picture of everything. I mean, they have flaws and irony and, conflict and mishaps. So what's the difference, in a way?
The difference is that Agnon, Bialik, and Brenner were grasping themselves as maybe the creators of a new major discourse, right? Language of writing, a new form of modernity. They were the ones who were about to revive a biblical Hebrew in the land of Palestine, in Zion, right? And recreate that language with a modern attire. Zarchi was coming from a different perspective, which I call in this book a minor one. He saw
You
himself...
call it a minor key. You have a
exactly,
musical
the minor
aspect
key, the
to
major
it.
and the minor keys, exactly. And of course, that takes after the well-known this typology of literature by theoreticians such as Deleuze and Guattari, who talk about Kafka, Franz Kafka, in the minor key, right? And Zarchi's writing about these minor figures, characters, hovering on the outskirts of the settlement, of the Yishuv, people who keep failing as pioneers, failing as husbands and wives, failing as coherent people or trying to create some kind of coherence, and as personalities, people who fall into the abyss of melancholy. So it's all about that notion of failure and downward, the way downward for him. Yeah.
What's interesting is that you describe his contemporaries as people who saw themselves creating the new literature, the new language, the new state of mind and being, whereas from your book, to my mind, in the reading of Zarchi, he seems like he is a subject of what's happening, maybe even a victim of what's happening. Is that a difference?
Yeah, definitely. He himself was drawn into melancholy, so there is not really much of a distance between him and his characters. Much of what he's writing is sort of an autobiographical reflection of what he experiences himself. So you can read in the stories, in the fiction, and I compare that to the diaries and the letters.
Yeah, and some points you say the diaries are almost indistinguishable from scenes in his book.
Exactly, which makes it a very interesting story because, of course, the literature encapsulates in some ways his mode of existence, his mode of thinking on the one hand, but he takes it one step further because, of course, with literary imagination you can explore further and in broader terms than reality suggests very often.
Well, this is an interesting question because, his literature was so personal and so deep and so much an expression of his melancholy, as you put it. How do we understand the bridge between that and the political? I mean, how do we know that he was offering a critique of the Zionist project, which is, it seems to me, your claim that the critics saw in his work?
So the argument I'm making here is I read backwards, of course. I read from the moment of the present. And for me, the questions he's raising are questions that at the same time are part of what exists within Zionism, right? So you were asking about his contemporaries. The melancholic tone is there in Brenner, for instance, Shchol and Kishalon, one of the best-known classic
Do we know the translation of that title?
Mourning and Bereavement would be
That would be the literal translation.
Yeah, I think it's Mourning and Bereavement, if I'm not mistaken. One of the best-known novels, classic novels of modern Hebrew. Agnon is writing all the time about melancholic figures. But again, I think they write about that melancholy as a form overcoming the hurdles rather than caving in and trying to explore.
So for them, the melancholy is the conflict, and then the resolution of the conflict is overcoming it.
Exactly. And where you overcome it or where you get with it is back into the formal discourse, right? Of revival, of victory, of creating something anew. For Zarchi, it's the opposite. It's the way of the failure and exploring that failure as fully as he could. And again, going back to his personal story, he's someone who, if you read the diaries and the letters, someone who depicts his own life in melancholic terms, someone who we would call today, someone who slides into clinical depression, and someone who dies at the age of 38 with cancer. So there's something very sad about the whole life story.
It's interesting when you talked about that overcoming that great conflict of the other contemporary writing. It sounds like the conflict resolution is not just triumph, but it's the national story of redemption and salvation. So what is the logical endpoint of Zarchi's stories? I mean, what would Zionism have been if it had reflected his path that he portrays in these stories?
So that goes back again to the gap we started talking about between the idealist language, discourse, and the personal failure, and where the affect of it, the melancholic affect, kind of gets into that gap, or what we talk about in melancholic, in the theory of melancholy, as that liminal state that allows us to explore the pros and cons of each of those layers, right? And taking that melancholic affect as a door, as an entrance into exploring Zionism and what Zionism is about. Of course, Zionism to begin with is concentrating, and this Klausner figure I talked about is one of those biggest representatives, best-known representatives of political messianism and the victorious language of Zionism. Zarchi is taking the opposite root. And in that sense, Zarchi's own life and Zarchi's own literature, I read that as something that is symptomatic, a symptom to the failure, because he himself lives through that, but something that also allows us to explore the failure or the expectation of that triumphalist language on the one hand and how melancholy undermines it on the other.
Yeah. I mean, you have a whole, fascinating chapter analyzing the theories of melancholy. And I also noticed that in the acknowledgments in the beginning, you dedicated the book, or at least you acknowledged and thanked your family and your children. You said, I wish them a future without melancholy. But I had to question that because, I mean, in your analysis of melancholy, and as we all know, a certain measure of spiritual torment is also creative and it drives us. And you point that out in your chapter on melancholy. We even have a song in Hebrew continuing the musical theme, Melancholy, You Are My Lover, right?
Yeah.
So tell us, do we need melancholy or should we have a future without it?
That's an excellent question. I think that goes back to the issue of that liminal state of melancholy. And there's a debate between the interpreters, right? Freud, for instance, on the one hand, when he's writing his best-known work on melancholy in 1915, and then the second version, 1917, Melancholy and Mourning and Melancholia, is talking about the fact that for him, melancholy is only pathological, is only abnormal. He goes back to those images of the Greeks, of melancholy as that black bile.
Black bile. Yeah, I have to say that black bile was not great for my stomach reading that, yeah.
So, but there's something also that captivates our imagination in that, right? Thinking about all those images of darkness, and other interpreters, more modern ones, especially after the Renaissance, 15th, 16th century, do point out that through the personification and then the politicization, right, turning into the political effect of that, we see how melancholy could be creative. And they go back again to Aristotle and say, well, even Aristotle said that when you look back at the genius, right, those creative personalities, you see that many of them are stricken by a state of melancholy. So yeah, there's something about that is always dual, that is always, again, going back into that gap, that is on the threshold between, on the one hand, being really creative, but on the other hand, if you let it slide one step too far, it gets into that state of acedia, of apathy, of ennui, right? Of some call it laziness, but that inability.
No, it's much deeper than laziness.
Yeah.
You also analyze, you sort of go a level deeper into the meaning of melancholy, and I think that in the Freudian analysis, you point out that it starts with a sense of a double loss, the loss of a previous life, and then the loss of the memory of that life. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So Freud's basic theory in that essay, and then Judith Butler actually took that and explored that further, Julia Kristeva as well, is that melancholy is a response to the loss of a loved one. And then Freud says there's another layer or another stage of that loss, which is the loss of the memory of that lost person, or the loss of the memory of what we had with that person, that relationship. So there's a double loss there. Now, Freud says the second layer of that loss, when we lose the actual person to some kind of affect, we become more identifiable with the sense of melancholy over what we lost rather than the person we actually lost, right? Or an ideal, it becomes idealized, and then it becomes too abstract. Now, the danger in that is that, first of all, we lose the actual memory. We lose the actual connection we had to the past, on the one hand. On the other hand, the attachment to the loss becomes either narcissistic, which is Freud's argument, and might kind of slide again into something that is fetishized, right? Because we fetishize the ideal of the person we lost, or that state of the past that we lost, and we fall in love with that very idea of the loss. So there are two stages of loss. There's a sense of double loss, and the second layer of that is where the melancholy usually is placed in psychoanalytical theory. Yeah.
And in the political experience of this generation in the 20s and 30s, how would you describe? Because you're talking about the loss of a person, but in this literary community, you're talking about a different kind of loss.
So when you take that and you take the theory of melancholy, and in Zarchi's case, what made me interested in him is he quotes Freud. He calls Freud Rabbi Freud, which is hilarious when you read through the diaries. So he takes that and he thinks through melancholia about his reality. And the reality is well historicized and backed with facts. Namely, There are historians of medicine and psychology such as Eran Rolnik and Rakefet Salashik who quantified the numbers, for instance, of suicides of pioneers during the early stages of the Zionist settlement. So between 1910 and 1923, the number of suicides is rising above the 10% of the deaths, the total deaths of pioneers. Eran Rolnik, the historian of medicine, is calling that epidemic proportions, right? That's pretty amazing. But this is, of course, something that is completely non-existent in the Zionist narrative. The Zionist narrative hardly ever mentions that the affect that drives people to suicide or the fact that that so many pioneers did commit suicide.
So he's definitely onto something. I mean, this is a fascinating chapter in Zionist history that we don't hear about too often.
Exactly.
He's onto something. Other people are experiencing melancholy or depression on such a severe level that they're killing themselves in epidemic proportions. I've always found this interesting. You have a different kind of insight into it. Why do you think there was this epidemic, if you had to look at it through the lens of the literature that Zarchi was writing?
And that brings us back exactly to that question of this gap or the theory of melancholy. Following the diaries and the letters, what you see is those pioneers first reporting about the sadness they experience, which, is all too self-explored and all too self-understood for us. They lost their parents, they lost their childhood, they lost, everything they had before.
Even though this is well before World War II and the Holocaust when we have the epic level of loss.
Yeah.
So how did they lose them? Because they came on their own?
They are coming, most of them, 90% of them on their own, without families. They try to settle in the land, depicting that, following that idealist language of self-realization in the land of Zion, in the biblical land, right? And they try to build a new life. The new life, of course, is based on the idea that they leave everything they experienced before behind and they forget it. Now, the Zionist discourse asks them to do something, even something more radical than that, which is to negate the sadness they feel. The language they're supposed to bespeak, they're supposed to reflect, right, and represent is a happy one, is a victorious one.
The horror dance.
Exactly.
And what happens to that horror dance in Zarchi's experience?
Zarchi's, in his diaries, he's writing, in my stories, there are no horror dances, right? There are no folk dances.
In other words, I'm not subscribing to this idealized narrative that I'm happy about the loss of my previous life.
Exactly.
Is that how we interpret it?
Exactly. So he dives into that sense of sadness and explores that and follows the pioneers that keep failing, cultivating the land, keep failing, making love to women, or if it's women to men, keep failing in even understanding where they are. So there's a sense of loss of space, the boundaries of space and time. And there's something that nearly and sometimes drives them nuts, crazy, right?
I'm also wondering, I mean, this is, again, you're looking at it through a political lens, but these are such personal, parts of his stories are so personal. And as you say, much of the complex has to do with who we are in relationships, our failures at finding love and communicating, with another individual. Maybe partly Zarchi felt like he was in a political kind of community that did not allow for individual experience. It was all about building the collective. Was that part of it also? Maybe why his literature wasn't appreciated so much, because it was such an intimate, personal focus?
Yeah, of course. That's the expectation. He emigrated during the second half of the 1920s. Everything during that time is about self-realization and Zionist discourse and building the land, right? It's all about building. It's all about construction. He himself is working in Solel Boneh. He's working in structures, building houses, building roads.
Solel Boneh being the kind of centralized construction company of the New Zionist project, right?
Exactly. Thank you for that explanation.
For our listeners.
Yeah. And with him, the interesting thing is that, again, working through melancholy, he's not just thinking about he's not just reflecting about the failure, his own failure, because he's pretty weak physically, right?
Well, I found that a very interesting part as well. I mean, so much of this project is focused on the body, the sturdy male body, as you put it in the book.
Yeah. That goes back to a long history.
That.
Yeah. Exactly. So that goes back to Max Nordau's ideal of Yahadut HaShririm, the muscular Jew, and the expectation that in the land of Zion, people will be healthy and muscular and women will be very fertile.
I think we never quite gave up on the women being fertile part of the idealized Zionist dream.
Yeah, let's not get into that.
Why? We know the statistics. We know that Israelis have higher birth rate on average than most other Western industrialized countries.
Yes.
So we don't need to debate it. It's a fact.
Yeah. I'm trying to stay with the history rather than turn immediately into present terms. But of course, and one of the connecting, and literally so, roads, paths that lead from that history to the present is, of course, you can see that with him actually working with Solel Boneh, with that construction company, working first within the territory of Palestine, but then actually following them into working on roads, building roads in the deserts of Iraq. And what he experiences there is something very interesting because he for the first time meets Marxists, anarchists, and Bedouin rebels against the British occupation. Because during that time, of course, the construction company, which Yuda Shenhav wrote about beautifully, is one of those imperialistic forces that spreads through Palestine into the deserts of Arabia, right, trying to modernize the Arab countryside in a very interesting way, which is, of course, again, connecting to the oil production. And then Zarchi is writing a novel he publishes in 1936, which he calls And the Oil Flows into the Mediterranean, where he reflects about actually those peripheral groups and how they try to rebel against that expansion.
Well, our listeners can't see it, but your eyes are just lighting up when you talk about his actual books. So I couldn't help but notice that this is a very enthralled kind of, not enthralled isn't the right word, a very, very deep engagement in this book with his literature. And so I had to ask myself, did you first fall in love with his literature and then decide to write this scholarly assessment of where his book fit into the Zionist narrative? Or did it start from your studies as a historian that you came across his work and said this is an interesting topic politically and on a literary level? Which came first?
Reading is always first, I find.
What was it about his literature that drew you in so much?
The first novella I read by him was about a novella he published in 1942. So when the Holocaust is already taking place and the knowledge of the Holocaust is taking place. It's called Malon Orchim, a lodging place, which is, of course, an allusion to Jeremiah's prophecy of destruction. And in that novella, he follows a small group of German Jewish refugees who find a small hostel in Jerusalem and live in that hostel as if in a bubble of their own. They speak German, they can't really understand the Hebrew, they contemplate about the state of, again, the construction of that new state, Jewish state, and the idealist language, which sort of leaves them out. And the interesting thing about this novella, which I found really mind-blowing, was that while he depicts the melancholy that accompanies that form of dissociation from one's reality, that sense of, a bubble or escapist existence on the outskirts of the Yishuv, of the Jewish Yishuv, turns into absolute apocalypse at the end. And again, into a suicide. I don't want to tell people too much because I'm translating, exactly. I'm translating part of that, just a small part of that novella in the book. But the allusions that are hidden under the text there are connecting one to different literary creations, production that are really rare within the Israeli or Jewish yeshuv at the time, such as Kleist's, Michael Kohlhaas, so the model of anarchist literature on the one hand, or it ends with sort of his take on the Book of Revelation, so a Christian apocalypse, which I found very intriguing, as a perspective and something that, again, breaks apart from what is considered to be the literature of the Yishuv of modern Hebrew.
Well, what's interesting also is that could it be said that he was just a bit ahead of his time? I mean, later on, the great Israeli novelist that I sort of grew up on in my process of becoming closer to Israel, like in the 70s and 80s and 90s, Grossman has figures of deep, deep melancholy, and they're coping with tremendous loss. I mean, Sea Under Love for me was a formative novel, and everybody's traumatized by the Holocaust. But he's not the only one, right? Of course, Oz has melancholy characters, and Yoshua. Are they reacting to a different kind of loss? Is it qualitatively different? Or does it have the same impact on their characters? And maybe he was just ahead of his time. Could that be? I know I have a lot of questions in there, so you can just address that however you want.
I take it as a question about continuity and how the melancholic mode is consistent with, but also changes along Israeli history. Let me answer that.
You said it better
briefly.
than me.
Well, I'm thinking about that mode, for a very long time. And let me give you an example, which I think might shed some light on that thought. So I'm moving between Zarchi's understanding of melancholy before the state is declared, right, in 1948. Zarchi dies in 1947, so right on the cusp of that new political entity. After that, there's a new type of melancholy. Michael Glusman just published a new book, actually starting exactly where I stop. And the funny thing is, he turns it upside down. For him, it's about the melancholy of sovereignty, right? For me, it's about the sovereignty of melancholy before 1948. For him, it's about the melancholy of sovereignty, right? After 1948. So Amichai and, the typical generation, first generation of Israeli writers. And from there, you can see how that evolves. And just one last example, Amos Oz, who grew up in Zarchi's house, and tells about Zarchi in A Story of Love and Darkness. One of the longest passages there is about a recollection about Oz's memories from Zarchi's study, as a kid playing around the books there. Is beautiful.
Oh, is that the passage where he wonders how the books are organized? In which order?
No, this is actually a passage. There's something there about how the books are organized, but in fact, that the fragment in Story of Love and Darkness is about how Zarchi helps his dad, Amos Oz's dad, right, who publishes his dissertation, and he buys, without the dad's knowledge, all the volumes and hides them behind the table, so the dad won't see that he was the one actually buying all those copies, and he's enthralled, right, the father. So Oz is depicting that he's playing behind the desk as a child, sees all the copies of the book of his dad, asks Zarchi, what is that doing here? And Zarchi is avoiding really the subject. He doesn't want to answer it.
But that's a very humane and compassionate gesture also.
Exactly. And I think that's something else that kind of zips into melancholy, right? It's some of it is really at the heart of what we see as a humanist or empathic existence to other people, as long as we don't fall into that narcissistic over-identification with our own sense of loss. But just one last sense about Oz. So Oz is one of those who are known, especially after 1967, as the representatives, one of the key representatives of Siach Lochamim, right? Combative discourse, which is now kind of ironically being discussed as the crying and shooting slogan.
Well,
right?
now, but of course, it's really something that emerges after 1967 and then after 1987 with the First Intifada. Both of these, the terminology. Maybe explain what shooting and crying is for listeners who aren't familiar with it.
So the shooting and crying, I don't know what to call it. It's an ironic idiom.
That's a good term.
Is a way to refer to those series of interviews that Amos Oz and Avram Shapira, Yitzhak Ben Aaron and others did with soldiers who came back from the 67 war and who depicted their experience of the war as a deep saddening experience. And the position of the interviewers was one of deep empathy and one that they continue to develop. Amos Oz is a clear example as a literary topos, right, as a literary mode of writing and reflecting about life in Israel. The idea of shooting and crying is, of course, first you shoot, then you cry over it. So that's the irony, looking back at that melancholia from behind and saying, yeah, what do you expect? If you first shoot and then cry and then ask questions, why are you surprised that melancholy is your very basic reaction to the reality on the ground?
And this is also an interesting sort of double inversion of the double loss, because first you have to commit an act that you're not so happy about, and that is a rebellion against the triumphalism of 1967 when we were all supposed to be, we Israelis, I wasn't here, but I wasn't even born, but Israelis were all supposed to be sort of euphoric. So there's originally a rebellion against that. But then you have to be, or I guess the crying part is criticizing that, but then the irony is that it became a trope of being critical of the left.
Exactly.
For hypocrisy.
Yeah.
If you're crying, why did you shoot in the first place?
Exactly. And that gets into the framing of the whole story, of the whole narrative. For me, and following a few theoreticians who talk about melancholy of the left, right? Which is one of the framing stories. So that's the historical topos again that is interesting for me. If we are identifying, or some of us identifying themselves with a left-wing critical position, we need to be able to distance ourselves from that form of what Walter Benjamin, the German Jewish author, thinker himself, committed suicide in 1940, right? Called left-wing melancholy, which was a critique of social democratic attack on the radical left. If that's the case, if you are invested in that form of left-wing melancholy, you need to be able to unpack what that means and then be able to depict it from somewhat an outside perspective, I find.
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, how do you not have this left-wing melancholy? Is the only way to get out of it to do what Zarchi did and open it up and and present and just put on display all the reasons why, life and society is so traumatic? Or is there some other angle for not being sort of indulgent with relation to the, sunk in this left-wing melancholy?
Again, that's an excellent question. I think that depends on how judgmental, I guess, you'd like to be about that. I'm trying not to. I'm trying to be a good historian and be empathic to the characters I follow. And in that respect, I want to explore also the creative side of melancholy and understand that potential for further exploration, for critical understanding of the reality.
There's so many more questions that come up. I'm not even sure where to end this. But I suppose my last question would be, do you see any parallels in modern literature? I mean, we talked about the middle generation of Israeli literature. Where do you see modern literature going in terms of exploring these, some of these themes? Do they even deal with such public themes anymore, even bridge the personal and the public in the way that you argue Zarchi did?
The argument I'm making, and that's again the beginning and the very end of the book, is I follow Zarchi's literary creation production with his daughters, Nurit Zarchi, who's one of the best-known contemporary authors in Israel and poetess. And her ability to use melancholy when she reflects about her own life, but also at the same time distance herself from it and see it from the distance of time and space. So on the one hand, when she reflects about her own past, she thinks about that black dog waiting for her outside the door, right? When she actually stays, or when she walks around the house, sees the light under her father's door on the one hand, and is reflecting about whether she should go out or not. So the black dog is waiting there.
The black dog being a symbol of the melancholy.
A symbol of melancholy, yeah. Right? Le chien rage, that's one of the Renaissance Alain Chartier symbols of the black bile, right, taking over.
And at the same time, she has this image in her head of his papers lost forever.
Exactly. And
Tell us what happened.
So that's part of the anarchistic, I think, gesture. She takes us as readers with her, with that story. The story is a story that she told me when I first started thinking about how to write that book. And I turned to her to ask if there are any further documents left by Zarchi. I found the archive, a small unknown archive in Gnazim Archive, the literary archive in Tel Aviv, and asked her if there are any further documents. And she told me this short story, which she then published a year and a half later in her own autobiographical novel. The story is about her leaving a suitcase full with her father's papers, unpublished manuscripts, essays, letters, etc., under the bed in her house in Tel Aviv. And coming back with her mother a few weeks later because the house was supposed to be demolished. And the date she got was for a certain day. She came a day before to pick up the suitcase, which she says is the last thing with a bed that was left there. And the two of them are getting close and they see a cloud of dust rising. And they look at the house and they see that the house is in the process of being demolished. And as they look, one of these wrecking balls, right? One of these wrecking balls is hitting through the upper floor, which is where the bedroom is, kicks, the bed out with a suitcase. The suitcase opens up in the air and all the papers are flying in the street above the treetops. And she depicts herself running after them, trying to collect them one by one. But of course, most of it was lost. That's the story. Now, of course, there's something that is deeply anarchistic, that is something that is, deeply anchored in literary imagination about that story of the past being lost and how do we respond to a past being lost. But it also refuses the gesture of falling in love with that past and the admission that we need to let go.
Wow, on that image of us trying to grasp the fragments of our past, we'll have to just end because there is no real end to this conversation and to this reality that we cope with of trying to understand our past. Thank you, Nitzan Lebovic.
Thank you so much, Dalia, and thank you very much all of you here for hosting me.
Great. And you've been talking about your book, Zionism and Melancholy, The Short Life of Israel Zarchi. I recommend it. Thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Georgia Foscarini and Itai Shelem, our producers, and to the Israel Institute for their generous support. Now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. We know you've always wanted to. Just go to the ratings and review section and then write one. It can be good, it can be critical. We like all kinds. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive with over 500 interviews. If you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel, and follow me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.